The farm sat at the very edge of Millhaven, where the last stretch of human fields gave way to the wilder land that belonged to the orc clans beyond the hills. It was not a large place, but it was enough. Enough to keep a man busy from dawn until the light faded and his hands ached in that familiar, satisfying way. Enough to fill the hours, so the silence did not press too heavily against the walls of the wooden house. I had lived here alone for 6 years now. The house had belonged to my parents before me, and after they were gone, I simply stayed. There was work to be done, and work had always been simpler than grief. The cattle needed tending. The barley needed cutting. The fences needed mending after every hard rain. I had grown used to the rhythm of it, used to eating at the scarred wooden table by myself, used to the sound of my own footsteps on the floorboards at night. Across the narrow stream that marked the boundary between our land and the next there was another farm. Smaller than mine, but well kept. The family that lived there were orcs. Boren was the father, a broad-shouldered man who spoke little but whose hands were never idle. His wife, Helna, moved through their garden with quiet patience, her voice carrying sometimes on the wind when she sang while hanging laundry. They had a daughter. I had known of her for years, the way one knows the shape of a tree that has always stood at the edge of a field. She worked beside them without complaint. I had seen her carrying baskets of vegetables to the village elders, seen her kneeling by the stream with sleeves rolled high, scrubbing clothes against the stones. We had exchanged nods, a few words about the weather, nothing more. I had eaten at their table once or twice, years ago when my father was still alive and the two families had been on neighborly terms. I remembered the daughter being polite, her eyes downcast as she passed the bread. I had thought little of it then. She was simply the girl from the farm across the water, a good daughter, that was all. Spring came late that year, and with it came the rains. 3 days of steady downpour turned the stream into something angry and swollen. When the sky finally cleared, I walked the boundary and found what I expected. A section of fence had been torn loose where the water had undercut the posts. 3 of them leaned at drunken angles, the wire between them sagging into the mud. I gathered tools and new posts from the shed and made my way down to the stream. The morning was cool, the ground still soft under my boots. I had just begun digging out the first broken post when movement on the far bank caught my eye. She was already there. The orc girl knelt at the edge of the water, a woven basket of dark cloth beside her. Her sleeves were pushed up past her elbows and her black hair was tied back loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands clinging to the side of her face from the damp air. She worked steadily, rubbing fabric against the flat stones, the motion of her arms sure and practiced. A low, steady melody drifted across the water. An old orc song, the kind passed down without written words. Her voice was quiet, almost private, as if she were singing only for the stream and the willows that leaned over it. I kept working. The post came free with a wet pull, and I set the new one in its place, driving it deep with the mallet. Every so often my gaze drifted back across the water. She did not look up at first. When she finally did, it was with the calm recognition of someone who had seen me working this same stretch of fence before. "Good morning," she called, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the running water. "The flood took the fence again?" "It always finds the weakest spot," I answered. She smiled faintly, the expression small but genuine. "My father said the same thing last night. He was planning to come down and check the posts on our side." I nodded. We fell into the kind of conversation that required little effort. Talk of the barley coming in well this season. Talk of old man Briggs and the stiffness in his back that always worsened after rain. Talk of the new calf born 2 nights ago and how it had taken its first unsteady steps that morning. Ordinary things, the sort of talk that filled the space between 2 people who had lived near each other for years without ever needing to know more. She wrung out a shirt and laid it across the basket. The green of her skin caught the morning light where the water had splashed her arms. There was a small scar along the inside of her left wrist, pale against the darker tone. I wondered briefly how she had gotten it. Then I pushed the thought away. It was not my place to wonder. When the last of her washing was done, she gathered the basket against her hip and stood. For a moment, she simply looked across the stream at the fence I was still working on. Then she inclined her head. "Be careful with the new posts. The ground is still soft." "I will." She turned and started back toward her family's house, her steps unhurried. I watched her go longer than I meant to. The basket swung gently at her side. The loose strands of her hair moved with the breeze. When she reached the rise that hid the house from view, she did not look back. I drove the last post into place and began threading the wire. My hands moved through the familiar motions, but my thoughts kept drifting. I had seen her like this before. At the stream, in the garden, walking the path into the village with a bundle of herbs for the elders, always quiet, always working, always there on the other side of the water. Yet something felt different this morning. The air after the rain, perhaps, or the way her song had lingered even after she stopped singing. Or simply the fact that, for the first time in a long while, the silence that usually waited for me back at the house did not feel quite so complete. I finished the repair and gathered my tools. The stream ran on, clear again, now that the flood had passed. I stood for a moment longer, looking at the place where she had knelt. Then I turned and made my way back across the field toward the wooden house that waited, empty as always, at the edge of the land I called mine. The end of July brought the summer festival to Millhaven, the way it always did. The whole village turned out for it. Long tables were set up in the square loaded with roasted meat, fresh bread, and Helna's honey cakes that disappeared faster than anyone could keep track of. Someone had built a bonfire in the center, and the musicians from the next valley had come with their drums and fiddles. By the time the sun dropped behind the hills, the air smelled of smoke and spiced cider, and the ground vibrated with the steady beat of dancing feet. I had not planned to stay long. Festivals were loud, and I had grown used to quieter evenings, but the barley was in, the fences were holding, and there was nothing urgent waiting for me back at the farm, so I stood at the edge of the square with a cup of apple cider in my hand and watched. The Stonebrook family had arrived early. Boren stood near the tables with a few of the other orc men speaking in low voices about the harvest. Helna moved between the food and the people who stopped to greet her, her hands never still, and their daughter was with them. She wore a simple dress the color of pale summer sky. Nothing fancy, just clean linen that moved easily when she walked. Her hair was braided back more neatly than usual, with a few small flowers tucked in at the side. She helped her mother arrange the last of the cakes, then stood back and spoke with the older women who came to compliment the baking. Her voice was calm, the same steady tone I had heard across the stream that morning months ago. I stayed where I was and drank my cider slowly. It did not take long for the young men to notice her. 3 of them approached within the space of half an hour. The first was the miller's son, broad and red-faced from the heat of the fire. She listened to whatever he said, then shook her head with a polite smile. The second was one of the traders who passed through every season. He tried longer, gesturing toward the dancers, but she declined again, still kind, still quiet. The third was the cooper's boy. She accepted his hand after a moment's hesitation and let him lead her into the circle of dancers. I watched them move through the faster steps. She followed the rhythm without effort, her expression pleasant but not bright with laughter. When the song ended, she stepped back, thanked him, and returned to her mother's side. The 2 who had been refused drifted away toward the cider barrel. I told myself it was none of my concern. She was free to dance with whoever asked. She was not mine to watch. The thought should have settled the small, unfamiliar tightness that had appeared in my chest. It did not. A slower tune began. The fiddler drew out longer notes, and couples moved closer together. Before I could talk myself out of it, I set the cup down and crossed the square. She saw me coming. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly replaced by the same calm she always carried. "Would you like to dance?" I asked. For a moment, she simply looked at me. Then she placed her hand in mine. Her palm was warm and steady. We stepped into the circle. I was not skilled at this. My feet found the beat late more often than not, and once I nearly stepped on the hem of her dress. She caught my arm to steady herself and gave a small, quiet laugh. "You are better at mending fences than dancing," she said. "Fortunately, the fences do not require music," I answered. She smiled at that, a real smile this time, and the tightness in my chest eased a little. We moved through the rest of the song without speaking much. Her hand stayed light in mine. When the music stopped, she did not pull away immediately. "Thank you," she said. I nodded. She returned to her family, and I went back to the edge of the square. The cider had gone warm in my cup, but I drank it anyway. A few days later, I was repairing the roof of the small shed near the southern pasture when I saw her walking the path that led toward Old Man Briggs's cottage. She carried a covered pot wrapped in cloth. I knew what it was. Helna's soup, the one she made whenever someone in the village was unwell. Briggs had been laid up with his back again after the last stretch of wet weather. I climbed down from the roof and wiped my hands on my trousers. "Going to Briggs?" I called. She paused and turned. "Yes. He should not be trying to cook for himself yet. I can walk with you. It is half a mile." "You do not need to." "I know," I said, "but I would like to." She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. We walked together along the edge of the fields. The sun was warm, but not yet heavy. She told me about the new lambs at their farm and how one of them had decided the garden gate was a toy. I told her about the section of pasture I had been reseeding and how the soil there always needed extra care after a hard winter. The conversation stayed easy, the way it had by the stream. She noticed things, small things. She mentioned that the Henderson place looked lower on one side this year and wondered whether the autumn harvest would be short. She remembered that Briggs liked his soup with extra barley and less salt. When we reached the cottage, Briggs was sitting on the bench outside, trying and failing to look like he was not in pain. She went inside to warm the soup. I stayed with him. He watched her disappear through the door, then turned his sharp eyes on me. "You are a fool if you do not see what that girl is worth," he said bluntly. I blinked. "Sir?" "She works harder than most men I know and complains less than any of them. She looks after her parents and half the village besides, and she is not the sort who needs to be told she is pretty every 5 minutes to know her own value." He shifted on the bench with a wince. "You have been living next to that family for years. If you have not noticed by now, then you are slower than I thought." I did not know what to say. Heat crept up the back of my neck. From inside the cottage came the sound of the pot being set on the stove. She must have heard. When she stepped back out a moment later, her cheeks carried a faint green flush, and she did not quite meet my eyes. Briggs grunted. "Food is ready. Go on, both of you. I can manage from here." We walked back in silence at first. The path was narrower in places, so we moved single file until it widened again. She spoke only when we reached the place where our lands met the main track. "Walking with someone to talk to is nicer than walking alone," she said quietly. I looked at her. She was watching the ground ahead of her, but there was a small curve at the corner of her mouth. "Yes," I said. "It is." She did not say anything else. When we reached the fork that led to her family's house, she stopped. "Thank you for coming with me." I watched her walk the rest of the way. The sun was lower now, turning the barley fields gold. I stood there longer than I needed to, thinking about what Briggs had said and about the way her hand had felt in mine at the festival. The farm waited ahead, the same wooden house, the same empty rooms. For the first time in a long while, the thought of returning to it did not feel quite so ordinary. A few weeks passed after the festival. The days settled back into their usual pattern of work and quiet evenings, but something had shifted in the space between them. I found myself noticing smaller things. The way the light caught on the stream in the late afternoon, the sound of her voice carrying across the water when she spoke to her mother in the garden, the fact that I sometimes paused at the boundary line longer than necessary, even when there was nothing left to mend. One clear afternoon, I went down to the stream again. A section of wire had loosened where the cattle had pushed against it. I brought the tools and set to work tightening the posts. The water was lower now, running clear over the stones. The willows along the bank hung still in the warm air. She appeared not long after, carrying the same woven basket she always used for washing. She knelt at her usual spot on the far bank, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and began working through the clothes with steady hands. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the water moving and the soft scrape of fabric against stone. Eventually, she glanced up. "You finished the shed roof?" "I did. It should hold through the next rain." She nodded, wringing out a shirt. "The farm always has something that needs fixing." "So do people," I said. The words came out before I thought about them. She paused, then gave a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. We talked for a little while after that, small things again. The price of barley at the market, the new well the village council was arguing about digging, the way old man Briggs had started walking with a stick but refused to admit it, helped. Ordinary talk, the kind that filled the air without asking for anything in return. But my hand slowed on the wire. I watched her more than I worked. The sun was high enough to reach the water, turning the surface into shifting pieces of light. It caught on the damp skin of her arms and the line of her jaw when she turned her head. Her black hair had come loose in a few places and clung to the side of her neck. She did not try to fix it, she simply kept working, her movements calm and sure, the same way she had moved through the festival crowd without ever seeming hurried or uncertain. I thought about the way she had walked beside me to Briggs's cottage, the way she had noticed the tilt in the Henderson field and remembered what the old man liked in his soup, the way she had danced without trying to draw every eye in the square. She carried herself like someone who had learned early that being useful mattered more than being seen, and I realized, standing there with the fence wire in my hands, that I had been seeing her clearly for some time now. I had simply refused to name what I was seeing. The thought settled heavy in my chest. Before I could stop it, the words left my mouth. "Arlena," I said, "whoever marries you someday will be very lucky." Her hands stilled on the fabric. For a long moment she did not move. The water kept running. A bird called once from the willows and went quiet again. I felt the silence stretch between us like something alive. She lifted her head slowly. Color had risen along her cheekbones, a deeper green against the lighter tone of her skin. She did not look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes held something I had not seen before, a mixture of fear and decision, both held very still. Her voice was quiet when it came, barely carrying over the sound of the stream. "I had hoped that would be you." The words landed between us with more weight than I expected. I stood on my side of the fence, the mallet still in one hand, and felt the ground under my boots become suddenly uncertain. Everything else, the fields, the sky, the sound of the water, seemed to pull back and leave only the space between us. I set the mallet down on the grass. "Arlena," I said again, and this time her name felt different in my mouth. "I meant that. Every word." "I know," she answered. Her voice stayed low, but it did not waver. That is why I could say it back. She told me then, still kneeling by the water with her hands resting on the edge of the basket, that she had thought of me for longer than the festival, longer than the walk to Briggs's cottage. She had watched me repair fences and mend roofs and walk alone across my fields for years. She had wondered whether I would ever look across the stream and see more than the neighbor's daughter. She had decided, after the dance and after the afternoon with the soup, that she could not keep pretending. The thought had never crossed her mind. I listened. The fence between us suddenly felt both too close and too far. "I have been slow," I said at last. "You have," she agreed. There was no anger in it, only a quiet honesty that made the space between us feel smaller. "But you are here now." I looked at the fence post I had been working on, then at the stream, then at her. "Would you let me do this properly?" I asked. "Come to your house. Speak with your father and mother the way it should be done." She studied me for a moment. The color in her cheeks had not faded, but something in her expression had softened. She nodded once. "Dinner is usually at 6. It was not a grand answer. It was not even a yes spoken out loud. But I understood what it meant. She was giving me permission to step across the line we had both walked around for years. I finished tightening the wire while she finished the last of the washing. Neither of us said much after that. When she stood and lifted the basket, she looked across at me one more time. 6, she repeated, softer this time. I nodded. She turned and walked back toward her family's house. I watched until she disappeared over the rise, the same way I had watched her leave weeks earlier. This time, the feeling in my chest was not the same quiet ache I had carried for years. It was something sharper and warmer at once. When I gathered my tools and started across the field toward the wooden house, the path felt shorter than it had that morning. The rooms inside would still be empty when I opened the door. But for the first time in a long while, the emptiness did not feel permanent. There was a time now. 6 o'clock. A place where someone would be waiting to see whether I would keep the promise I had made without meaning to. I set the tools back in the shed and washed the dirt from my hands at the pump. The water was cold and clear. I stood there longer than I needed to, letting it run over my wrists, and thought about the words that had passed between us by the stream. They had not been dramatic. They had not been planned. But they had been true. And truth, once spoken, has a way of changing the shape of the days that follow. The next evening I walked across the boundary with a small basket of Helna's honey cakes and a bunch of wildflowers I had gathered from the edge of the barley field. The sun was low, painting everything in long gold light. When I reached their door, Boren opened it himself. He looked at the basket, then at the flowers, then at me. His face gave nothing away. "You are here for a reason," he said. "I would like to court your daughter," I answered. "Properly, if she is willing, and if you and Helna have no objection." He studied me for a long moment. Behind him, Helna appeared in the doorway. She saw the flowers and smiled in the quiet way she had, as if she had already known this conversation would come. Boren stepped aside. "Come in. Helna has made too much stew again. That first dinner was careful. We spoke of the harvest and the price of lumber and the new calf at their farm." Arlena sat across from me and passed the bread without meeting my eyes too often. When the meal ended, Boren walked me to the door. "She is not a girl who smiles for every man who asks her to dance," he said. "She works harder than most and expects little in return. If you see only the quiet, you will miss what she is." "I see her," I said. "I want to keep seeing her." He nodded once and closed the door behind me. After that, the evenings changed shape. I began eating at their table 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes, Helna sent Arlena over with a covered dish when I had worked late in the fields. Other times, I crossed the stream with whatever I had repaired or mended that day. We walked together from her house down to the fence by the stream and back again. The conversations grew longer. We spoke of the coming winter and which fields needed resting. We spoke of her parents growing older and what that would mean for the farm. We spoke of the future without ever naming it directly. One evening, she decided I should learn to make the apple tarts her mother baked in the Orc style, with spices that came from traders who passed through the northern hills. She set the ingredients on the table in her kitchen and showed me how to roll the dough without tearing it. My first attempt stuck to the board and burned at the edges. She laughed, the sound low and warm, and scraped the ruined tart into the fire. "You mend fences better than you handle dough," she said. "I can learn," I answered. She looked at me over the bowl of filling. "I know. That is what makes you dangerous." The winter settled in hard that year. Snow came early and stayed. On the days when the weather allowed, I worked on the wooden house that had stood unchanged since my parents died. I did not tell her what I was doing. I replaced the leaking sections of roof with new thatch. I built proper cabinets along the kitchen wall so there would be space for more than one person's plates and cups. I leveled the floor where it had sunk over the years. And on the eastern wall, where the morning light came in strongest, I cut a new window and framed it carefully with wood I had planed smooth by hand. I chose the east side because I had noticed over the months that she always rose early and liked to work where the light was good. I wanted the house to feel like a place that had room for her habits, not only mine. In February, the snow finally thinned enough for travel. Arlena and Helna came across the boundary one afternoon to return a borrowed saw. Helna stayed outside to speak with the cattle while Arlena stepped into the kitchen to warm her hands by the stove. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the new cabinets and the fresh boards on the floor. Then her eyes moved to the window on the eastern wall. She turned to me. "When did you make this window?" "Through the winter." "Why facing east?" I wiped my hands on a cloth. "So, there would be good light in the mornings for you." She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the small fire in the stove and the wind moving against the new thatch. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than usual. "You built it before I was here. I wanted it to be ready if you ever were." She crossed the small space between us and took my hand. Her fingers were cold from the walk, but they held on firmly. "Thank you," she said. I understood she was not only thanking me for the window. She was thanking me for thinking of her in a place where she had not yet stepped. Spring came slowly after that. The snow melted into the ground, and the barley began to show green again. We continued the walks and the shared meals. Sometimes we argued small things about whether a gate should be moved or whether the new calf needed more feed. The arguments never lasted long. One of us would always end them by reaching across whatever space was between us and touching the other's wrist or shoulder, a quiet reminder that we were still learning how to stand side by side. One evening in early March, we stood at the fence by the stream after dinner. The water was high with meltwater and loud. She leaned against the post I had driven in last spring and looked across at my fields. "Your house feels different now," she said. "It is still the same house." "No," she answered. "It has space in it that was not there before." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We stood together until the light faded and the first stars appeared above the hills. When she turned to go back to her family's farm, she paused at the boundary line. "Tomorrow," she said, "if the weather holds." I nodded. She walked away, and I watched until she was only a shape against the darkening fields. Then I turned toward the wooden house that waited on the other side of the stream. The new window faced east, catching the last of the light. Inside, the rooms were still quiet, but they no longer felt like they were only waiting for one person to return. They were waiting for the next evening, and the one after that, and for whatever shape the days would take once two lives stopped moving in parallel and began slowly to move together. November arrived with cold mornings and yellow leaves on the willows along the stream. I had carried my mother's silver ring in my pocket for 3 weeks. It was a simple band, worn smooth at the edges from years on her hand. I had taken it from the small wooden box where it had sat since she died, and every morning I felt its weight against my thigh when I worked. I had thought about asking on the hill above the barley fields at sunset or in the warmth of her family's kitchen after dinner. In the end, I knew the only right place was the old fence by the stream. That was where we had first spoken the truth out loud. That was where everything had changed, without either of us planning it. She came down in the late afternoon, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders and the washing basket on her hip. The air was sharp enough that our breath showed. I was already there, leaning against the post I had driven in the spring before last. She set the basket down and looked at me with the quiet attention she always gave when something felt different. I did not try to make it beautiful or long. I had waited long enough. "I know I have been slow," I said. "I know it took me too long to see what was standing right in front of me. But I see you now. Every day. I want to build a roof and a life and a family with you. I want the days to belong to both of us instead of running side by side." I took the ring from my pocket. The silver caught what little light remained. "Arlena Stonebrook, will you marry me?" She stood very still. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. A small smile started at the corner of her mouth and grew until it reached her eyes. "Yes," she said. I slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been waiting for her hand. She stepped across the narrow space between us and put her arms around me. We stayed there beside the old fence while the stream ran past and the yellow leaves drifted down around us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was nothing left that needed saying. We were married in April, when the willows began to push out new green. Half the village came. Helena cried openly and tried to hide it behind her hands. Bourne gripped my forearm so hard I felt it for 2 days afterward. Old Man Briggs sat in the front row and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear that the fool had finally figured it out. Arlena wore a simple dress the color of new cream that her mother had sewn. When she walked toward me between the rows of chairs set up in the square, I knew I was looking at the rest of my life. After the wedding, we joined the two farms in everything but name. She kept the accounts and planned the planting with a steadiness I had never managed. I repaired what needed repairing and opened new pasture where the soil allowed. We argued sometimes, once over a gate that kept swinging open in the wind. Once because I forgot to bring salt from the village, once because she had worked through a fever and would not admit she was tired. The arguments never lasted past evening. One of us would always reach for the other across the table or the bed or the space in front of the fire, and the day would settle again. Years passed. The wooden house grew another room and then another. Children came, first a boy with his mother's quiet eyes and then a girl who laughed like her grandmother. They learned to run along the boundary line and to splash in the stream where their parents had once washed clothes and mended fences. Sometimes, when the light was right, I would stand at the new window that faced east and watch them play near the old posts. The wire had been replaced twice since the first spring I met her there. The wood had weathered to the same gray as the rest of the fence. Only the post I had driven that day still stood exactly where I had left it. One afternoon, when the children were chasing each other through the yellow leaves that had fallen again, Arlena came to stand beside me. Her hair had threads of silver now, and the lines at the corners of her eyes were deeper. But her hand found mine the same way it always had. I looked at her and said the words that had started everything. "Whoever marries you will be very lucky." She turned her head and smiled the same small, real smile she had given me across the water all those years ago. "I had hoped it would be you," she answered. The stream kept running. The children kept laughing. The fence stood between two fields that had long since stopped belonging to separate people. I thought about how long it had taken me to cross it, and how little it had cost once I finally did. The life we had built was not loud or remarkable to anyone outside the boundary. It was made of shared meals and mended roofs and arguments that always ended with someone reaching across the space between us. It was made of the mornings she worked in the light from the eastern window and the evenings we sat by the fire while the children slept. That was the moment the story truly began. Not when I first saw her by the stream and not when I asked her to dance at the festival. It began the day I finally said the words out loud and she answered with the truth she had carried for years. Everything before that had been preparation. Everything after was the life we had been slowly building without knowing we were building it. We stood together at the fence until the light faded and the children came running back, leaves in their hair and mud on their boots. Arlena took the girl's hand. I lifted the boy onto my shoulders. We walked back toward the house that had once been only mine and was now ours in every way that mattered. The stream followed us for a little while before turning away toward the hills. Behind us, the old fence settled into the evening the way it always had, holding the boundary between two lives that had stopped needing a line to keep them apart.